Hello, everyone, and welcome to this session of the Rosalind Franklin Society 2020 End of the Year Virtual Meeting. I'm your host for this discussion, Juliana Lemure, science writer at Genetic Engineering and Biotechnology News. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're so pleased to be able to gather virtually to celebrate the legacy of Rosalind Franklin, who would have turned 100 this year, and highlight outstanding issues impacting women in science from some legendary scientists and science communicators. It's an absolute pleasure to be hosting this panel today to focus on diversity and STEM. It's an honor to have two women joining us here today. If you are on Twitter, you've probably noticed hashtags this year that start with hashtag Black in, followed by a scientific discipline. First, there was Black in STEM, then Black in Neuro, then about a dozen more Black in weeks that followed. In August, one of the weeks was Black in Genetics, or BIG, an organization dedicated to amplifying the voices and work of Black identifying geneticists across the United States and beyond. We are delighted to have one of the co-organizers of Black in Genetics, Alexis Stutzman, a third-year graduate student in the Biological and Biomedical Sciences program at UNC Chapel Hill School of Medicine, here today to tell us more about the Black in movement. Second, you may know her as Raven Baxter, or more likely, Raven the Science Maven. If you haven't heard of either of those names, well, then you probably have not been paying close enough attention. Raven wears multiple hats, including science communicator, social media influencer with a following of almost 50,000 on Twitter, founder of hashtag Black in Science Communication, rapper, and PhD candidate in the science of learning at University of Buffalo's Graduate School of Education. After a short talk by both Alexis and Raven, we'll have time to chat more about diversity in STEM and how to enact change for the future. Alexis, I'll pass it to you now to tell us about Black in Genetics, how it went in August, what came out of it, and what you'll be up to next.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Juliana. So she mentioned I'm Alexis. I'm a current third-year graduate student in the curriculum for genetics and molecular biology as part of the Biological and Biomedical Sciences program at UNC. And in August, I founded Black in Genetics, which is a hashtag that occurred on Twitter. And since then, we have incorporated ourselves as a nonprofit and are moving forward as establishing ourselves as more of a scientific society. Our goals are to, of course, amplify work and voices of Black identifying scientists, specifically those in genetics. Since the conclusion of Black in Genetics Week, we have been pushing for connecting Black identifying trainees with the organizations who are seeking to hire them. As part of this, we created a job board that's now live on our website, and various universities across the United States have been using that to recruit Black identifying geneticists as part of their departments. And also we've had some genetic counselor positions that have come up. We also want to provide the scientific community with resources on understanding racial inequity in the genetics field specifically. So this was a big part of the Black in Genetics Week that we wanted to highlight and really remind geneticists that they're the ones who are actually studying the data that can either reinforce or debunk racist rhetoric. So we would like to, work to provide resources to the greater scientific community about making our spaces more equitable and more intentional with the way that we communicate our science, so that hopefully, we can work towards debunking racist rhetoric rather than publishing our data and then seeing what society has to do with it later. We're also working to educate public on research, recent advancements in genetics, and we're working in the future to continue building community and provide a platform to host conversations about dismantling racism in science and in the greater society. So with that, I'll pass it back to Juliana.
Okay, thanks so much for that, Alexis. Raven, I think that we should give everyone a small snippet of at least one of your most recent projects. Do you mind if I play a moment of your latest hit, Antibodies?
Go for it.
The category biology, lesson on immunology, little microbiology, this is the terminology. I got the vaccine and now you got me on the right night. Beast know the haters when they see him, so it's fight night. Antibodies make the haters see the bright light. Compliment they poke holes in chest like a white knight. Opsonizer, baby, that me make it tasty. Macrophages, they be looking, they might eat it up, they might bite. NK natural killers making haters going night night. Neutralizers, block shot, replay it in the highlights. Fluorinated, sticky, stick together like it's white rice. Scary little germs run away cause it's fight night. Everybody asking me, what's a vaccine? Bad beat, scientists in the LAB. Checking for the right nucleic acids and proteins. We making shots to build up your adaptive immunity. Body, yaddy, yaddy, antibody, yaddy, yaddy. Antibody, yaddy, yaddy, yaddy.
Okay, terrific. Thanks for letting us play that. I will say I've been teaching immunology. I'm a PhD in microbiology. I've been teaching immunology for years, and I'm sure my students wish I would start rapping in the middle of lecture. Actually, maybe not me, but they definitely would like to hear that rap for sure. I will play it for them in class.
I'll teach you how to rap. Don't worry.
So please tell us, how did you get started on your path in becoming a science communicator and a social media influencer and a rapper and all of the above?
Well, I think that many people like me found a love for science perhaps earlier in their lives, and I've really stuck with that passion for exploration and interest in the natural world around me, and pursued that throughout college and did relatively well, and eventually made my way to corporate and worked as a corporate scientist and realized that um, although I did really love science, I felt like I had so much more to give than what I was doing at that time. I have a lot of strengths in community building and in the social, doing a lot of social work. And I wanted to see more people who look like me in STEM. I wanted to help improve the culture around STEM as a whole. And I love to teach, I love to educate. So I worked as a corporate molecular scientist for some time, and I decided to leave that position and work at a community college. And that experience as a community college professor really solidified my interest in continuing to teach at that level and understanding that I have a calling and a mission to fill in a space in higher education, teaching biology and helping to build the confidence up or build up the confidence of incoming scientists. And now that I am in a doctoral program that is in an education department, I feel like I've grown so much as a person. The type of thinking that we do as molecular scientists is very different from the type of thinking that an education scientist does. So I've really enjoyed using all of my brain and learning how to use all of my skills and talents to help learners effectively not only learn science but communicate their science as well. And I do that in person, and now I do it online as Raven the Science Maven, and I'm looking forward to continuing to work in higher education as well.
Okay, terrific. So you were both heavily involved. I want to go back to the Black-in weeks for a little bit and just talk about those. So, I mean, Alexis, you did such a great job describing all the work that's going on since that week. And that's actually one of my questions is, they were so big on Twitter when they were happening, which, I mean, again, there were like probably 4 months that there was a week that was a Black-in week. And so, what were the biggest takeaways from the movement, and what are the parts of it that and I'll start with you, Raven. What are the parts that you think will continue on that like really made inroads from that movement?
I'm I first want to say that maybe when I was working in corporate as a molecular scientist, I really wish that I had the community that has been created really this year in the Black in movements. And at the time, I think this was only 3 years ago, right? I didn't know of any other Black scientists in person. And I also didn't know of any organizations, professional organizations for Black scientists specifically. There's NSBE, which is the National Society of Black Engineers, which does house some space for Black scientists. I didn't know that because of the name of the organization. I didn't find out until this year that some of my science colleagues joined NSBE, which is an engineering society, and they had a space there. But there weren't any intentional spaces for Black scientists to learn from each other and share resources and understand each other's experiences. So when Black Birders Week started, it was very interesting to see people kind of just come out of their hiding places, right? And come out of the woodwork and congregate as one. I had no idea. It was very powerful, even though I am not an ecologist, I'm not a birder. It was extremely powerful for me to know that people who were once hidden are now coming, into visibility, and not only just being seen, but also creating a space to be and exist in the field and exist comfortably. And Black in STEM, I think, had already existed at that point, but I saw other Black in movements kicking off, including Black in genetics, which was awesome, by the way. You did a great job, Alexis. And I really do think that with all the leadership that we're seeing in these weeks coming about and these organizations being formed, it's completely changing the atmosphere for STEM culture. And we are creating so many spaces for people to find their way in STEM. And I'm very excited to see what the future of STEM looks like with all of these places that people, Black people, people of color as a whole can come to and truly feel like they can belong somewhere. And it's also been very encouraging to see the support from allies of the Black community coming to help and coming to amplify and spread these messages that we're trying to spread.
Alexis, do you want to add anything to that?
I mean, I would really echo what Raven was saying. It's about the community that was formed, but I think more than that, I've like made friends through all of this that I totally would not have even like knew existed without these Black in Weeks. And it's not just people who are in genetics. There's been a lot of bridging across different fields, and just has, I don't know, it's been quite the community of interdisciplinary scientists, more so than just like each of our own little pockets of community. There's been a lot of I want to say cross culture, but I guess cross discipline going on, and finding all of these commonalities that we have, despite the fact that, one of my friends may be an astrophysicist and I have no clue what they're talking about. That's fine, because we have a whole lot of things that actually are similar in the way that we go through life.
Okay, great. Thanks. So now, what about people who are not on Twitter or social media? Many scientists are not on social media. In fact, coming from an academic past, I know academic scientists who really eschew social media, like, I don't have time, and things like that. So how can this community building, making spaces, like you were saying, the job board, Alexis, how can these things be communicated to people who are not necessarily on Twitter or other social media?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's part of the motivation that we had for establishing ourselves as more of a proper scientific society, because we wanted to have a community that existed outside of the virtual space as well, and eventually meet each other face to face at some point. So in terms of engagement, I think part of our goal is to provide a platform for amplifying these voices. And so doing the legwork of actually like going out and speaking directly with universities. I think that's something that we could do on our end in the future. And then there's also been a lot of talk between the different Blacken Weeks about having some sort of conference and coming together to create a greater society for Black people who are studying, all of these different things in academia. It's not just STEM. There's also humanities, and I guess SciComm is kind of on this outskirts of STEM, kind of not. But so there are all of these different disciplines that do have Black identifying people that do feel very alone. And there are a lot of supports. So I think of like ABRCAMs when you're a younger trainee that totally go away as you continue on in STEM. And so I think part of this movement, like the power of this movement, has been connecting people of a lot of different ages and reminding them that, you are not alone. There's support at multiple different levels. And so having some sort of conference and like actual proper scientific social space, I think would be a good way of pulling in people outside of just sitting on their phones and tweeting and that kind of a thing.
Absolutely. I second everything that Alexis shared. And I want to just add onto her point and say for Black in SciComm, one of the things that we've really focused on is reminding people of the power of their voices and building up their confidence so that they can go out in the world and not just communicate their science, but also feel comfortable impacting change. So the hope is that we amplify people's voices enough so that they feel like, they matter and that they can go out into the world and influence any changes that they need to see, whether it be at the workplace or at a college or university.
And I actually did remember one more point while Raven was speaking. So there have been a couple of publications and journals that have been really focusing on highlighting the Black perspective. And that's something that, is going to be in science's faces, whether or not they are on Twitter. There are a lot of I think that the movement started on Twitter and it caught the attention of a lot of these publications and universities. And so now they're doing a lot of outreach towards us too, to do exactly what you're talking about and put these things in front of scientists.
Terrific. Yeah, thanks so much for sharing all of that. What do you think are kind of like, Alexis, you were talking about how there might be like all of the Blacken Weeks coming together for like more of a universal group and maybe even bringing the humanities. And it just got me to thinking, what do you think are the specific challenges for Black women in STEM or people of color in STEM that maybe are different from challenges that exist in other fields like humanities?
I think that in STEM, we oftentimes forget that the people conducting the experiments are people and not robots. And so when things happen like, murders and things like that, those stick with us and come into the lab, whether or not we're showing it on our faces. Where I feel that in humanities, because the content that they're studying is, a lot more focused on people, perhaps it's easier to remember that. So I guess that's one difference I could potentially think of. And just kind of the general expectation that there's like a wall between your outside world and your at the bench world. And when you're at the bench, you put in your headphones and you stick to yourself. And it's just inherently not, it can be very isolating and just not at all very social. And so I think that, deconstructing that expectation is really important. And I think that's part of what even Raven was talking about with trying to empower people to go out and speak for themselves and, remove that barrier because it's not actually real.
Absolutely. I agree with everything Alexis said. And to build on her point about like the social awareness aspect. I think there's a lot of social and cultural unawareness in STEM as a whole. And I think that as people try and attempt to diversify their workspaces, I feel as though the inclusion and equity part is sometimes an afterthought, right? Like we get people in the door, they're here, and then people fail to realize that the work environment is not best suited for the people that they want to have work there. And oftentimes, due to lack of cultural or social awareness, people of color are uncomfortable, in these positions. And because we are a marginalized population, it's often hard for us to find our voices because we are marginalized, and we're basically tiptoeing around everyone else for the most part. And that takes a toll. That takes a big toll on people. I feel like that's a big reason why it's hard to retain marginalized people in these environments. So that's why it's such a big focus of mine to improve STEM culture. And I think that if we all continue to work together and understand what role each of us has in improving this, we could really make a great impact.
So that's a great point, and leads me to ask, what do you think is one thing or the biggest thing that everyone who's listening today, that everyone can do to enact change?
Yeah, I mean, from my personal point of view, I think asking questions is one of the most powerful things you can do. So these questions can be your way of engaging with diverse people and difficult topics. I think that one of the best ways to approach diversity is with curiosity rather than with any type of judgment. So asking questions and checking in on people who are marginalized is one kind of way of doing that. But more importantly is asking questions to the leaders and the people who are already in those positions of power who could make these bigger changes and say, I've noticed that in our department, we have all of these claims to commitment to diversity, but we can't keep a person of color in our department. What is going on? And really being brave and trying to bring out whatever those issues are and put them directly in the face of the leaders who are there and can change them quickly.
Absolutely. Alexis, one of my questions is, one place to make real change is to have influence in the rooms where it happens, hiring decisions, funding decisions. So how do we get into those rooms? And I mean, you just gave just kind of go do it, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's how I feel myself. I've gone to the head of my department, my interdisciplinary department, and the kind of like diversity leaders together. And I'm shocked at how much is just like thrown off to the diversity leader who isn't the director of the department. The director of the department is the one who should be making all of these, decisions and things ultimately, but they oftentimes kind of will wave it to the side and put it to like a task force or a diversity and inclusion officer. And ultimately that's not going to get anywhere if the department head isn't actually on board with what's going on and isn't actually committed to that.
I'm with you 100%. I have nothing else to add. Well said, Alexis. Very well said. Yes.
So, but now what can someone do? Here's just a follow-up. If you're not comfortable in that role or, doing that, or if you think that, for example, that might, affect your employment or something, like, what if you really aren't comfortable just doing that? Like, what are other steps that can be taken actually?
Yeah, I mean, there's strength. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
You go ahead.
I was just gonna say, I think part of this all of these Black and X weeks have shown there are strength in numbers, like absolutely positively. And there's been a lot of pressure that has been coming from, journals, like I mentioned, and just kind of like the general expectation of the scientific community is that you are putting effort into being equitable and, trying to commit yourself to having a diverse space. So my recommendation would be to, if you yourself are not comfortable, perhaps find other people who can support you and don't go alone. If it comes from multiple voices, then it's a lot, that can be a lot more powerful than if it were coming from only one person.
Absolutely. I love everything that you're saying today. Um, and I just wanted to add, document everything, get things in writing, document all of your experiences, follow up your conversations with emails, and also remember that we are all humans. These power structures are all things that are just created by man, but we all come into this world equal. And we all should have equal opportunity to voice our opinions. And I'm really adamant about reminding people of their voices, because we all have one and we should all use it to improve situations that need to be improved. I get really sad when I hear about people who want to speak up but can't because they're afraid of some sort of hierarchy. And some of these fears are very logical, but it really does hinder a lot of people from doing the right thing. And I think we all need to kind of learn how to get uncomfortable and speak up when we need to speak up.
Absolutely. Okay, terrific. So let's switch just to chat a little bit more about social media. So representation matters on social media. So which platform has provided the best community feedback for both of you?
I think that's pretty easy for me, just because all of our activity has gone on Twitter. So that's where we live and where all of our engagement kind of happens. And there's been actually a lot of engagement, I would say, in the direct messages where people don't have to put it out in the public and the open eye. I've actually even had like phone calls from people at different universities who are wanting to participate in cluster hires, but they're a little unsure of how to navigate that and these kinds of things. And so I guess Twitter, but by way of direct message.
That's really interesting. Yeah, I'm glad you said that. I wouldn't have guessed that, but that it makes a ton of sense. And I'm really curious to know like what other things people are interested in sharing like privately with Black in genetics.
Yeah, I mean, it's more asking questions, I think. I think actually this really ties into our previous question. There are people who are concerned about how it will look to their peers, and so they want to ask privately rather than publicly. And so, yeah, there have been conversations in our private messages about, asking for advice on different things. We've had a couple of general members of the public who have had questions about genetics generally. And so there was one in particular asking about like the history of bipolar disorder and whether or not it affects different marginalized communities disproportionately. And so, yeah, I think this really is coming down to like the shame that people put on themselves, or like they're potentially afraid of having if they were to ask it publicly. And then there have been also plenty of younger people reaching out and saying, "Hi, I'm so excited that this is a thing. How can I help? How can I be involved?" Or "I need help applying to graduate schools," that type of deal.
Very interesting. And your point about the question the person had for you about marginalized communities and like health disparities is really important, because there is so much mistrust in science and the medicine community from the Black community. And rightfully so, because of the tragedies that have occurred at the hands of the US government. You know, there's a lot that needs to be apologized for that hasn't been, and that's left a lot of people not trusting. And so it's really important that we are visible and that we do have a presence. For me, Black in SciComm does exist largely on Twitter, just as Black in Genetics does. And a lot of the feedback that I'm getting is, wow, I've never seen a Black scientist before. Or like, people will share that, people will tag Black in SciComm in something and they'll want our opinion, right? Because they trust our opinion because we look like them. They sense that we have a shared experience and they want to hear, they trust, you know, people who have shared experiences with them or as they do, to communicate different scientific findings that are happening in current events and et cetera. And people, we are really filling in a gap that desperately needed to be filled, especially in a pandemic, between science and the public, but particularly between like marginalized people in the public and science. And it's just so important. I can't imagine a better time for this movement to be happening. Of course, earlier is always better, but you know, better late than never. And I think now is a great time.
Absolutely. Yeah. And actually, that leads into another question, which, I mean, of course, we should talk about COVID-19. And what do you think about kind of the movement that's been, I've seen a couple of articles over the last couple of weeks saying that the vaccine really should be, that Black communities and communities of color should be prioritized in vaccine distribution. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I don't think they should do that because of the mistrust and because of the optics. If they prioritize marginalized communities, there's already so much trauma, generational trauma that we've experienced in the medical history of America. If you target marginalized communities, even if it's for good intentions, it's not going to feel comfortable for a lot of people. It's not going to look good for a lot of people who might have taken the vaccine otherwise, right? I definitely think that that should not be the approach. It's going to trigger people and make people very suspicious. So I don't think that's a good thing. I understand the good intentions behind it, but just being socially and culturally aware, I know that it's not the best thing to do.
Yeah. And kind of piggybacking off of that, I think the perhaps more the more nuanced way of doing that is just diminishing any barriers to access to that vaccine rather than going out and, you know, posting up in these, you know, on a corner where you know that there are a lot of Black people who live on the south side of Chicago, that type of deal. Instead of doing that, perhaps making this vaccine accessible from like the grocery store or in every CVS and Walgreens that exists, because, you know, people of color who are going to engage and actually trust, they can do that on their own volition without it being put in front of them. I think people are smart enough to do that, and they're also smart enough to realize that they have been disproportionately affected by this virus.
So what are some, now with the new administration coming in and with the science team to be announced any day, what are some recommendations that you might have for the new administration, specifically in science policy?
So I think tip top, we need to rebuild public trust. It already, as Raven pointed out, it already was wavering, but with the previous administration, it is just in the trash can. And so I think there really needs to be intentionality and cohesion to, you know, reestablish that sense of science is something that is trustworthy. I think we can do this by reminding the public that science actually does save lives, and we can show the public, you know, look into this hospital where there are people whose lives are being saved at the hands of science, and just reiterating all of these kind of basic facts that, you know, to me are so obvious, but now don't feel so obvious to the rest of the world. And I think that a great place to start is with COVID-19, as we were just talking about. And I hope that the success of the vaccine can remind everyone once again that science is actually real and scientists should be trusted. Now, in terms of diversifying our scientific spaces, once again, I think intentionality is key here. We have to get people who look like us in positions of power and leadership. It's not that we don't have those people who have the qualifications, it's just that they're not actually getting these positions. And I actually think that that is really powerful. There was a dean of, I think, engineering at the University of Ohio. It was just announced in this last week, and like that brought me life to see that there is somebody who is a woman of color, a Black woman, and she is in charge of things. That is a lot different than seeing, you know, a lot of people who look like me just in my spaces. That's awesome, and I think that we're moving in the correct direction, but it feels very empty if I'm not seeing them stay in my spaces.
Raven, anything to add to that?
Yes. Excellent points again, Alexis.
Raven.
Well, in addition to Alexis's points, I'm education focused for the most part, and I think that a lot of the rebuilding that we have to do is at the very basic level in our school systems, and making sure that we are graduating students that have a level of science literacy that can keep up with the pace of with how much our world is changing and how much information we have. We need to standardize that across the board. Everyone, every school, every student needs to have science literacy training. It must be a mandatory part of our curriculum or our initiatives. And I think that with that, we will see a generational closing of the gap between science and the public, hopefully. And Alexis did share some of the thoughts that I had about diversity in STEM, and also just being very intentional about whose voices we're amplifying in these leadership positions. I agree with everything that she shared.
Okay, great. So I always like to ask people, Raven, what is next on your to-do list?
That's a scary question because I feel like it changes every week for the better, right? I'm very grateful for the opportunities that I've been given this year and that are coming along down my path. I'm looking forward to graduating with my doctorate in science education in 2021. So, woo, early grad party here. But until then, I'm going to be working very hard on that, and also just focusing on, I have a few potential TV opportunities coming on my way, and we're finalizing things with that. I want to continue making music. I want to figure out how do I teach as many people around the world as possible. I'm thinking about potentially giving like online courses. So I'm very excited. There's a lot coming, so just stay tuned. I don't even know. I don't even know what's next, but any of those things.
Sounds like a very long to-do list. You'll be very busy, I'm sure.
But also continuing to create programming for Black in science communication. I know we have a lot of initiatives down the pipeline. We want to have a Wikithon, which is basically we're going to be making sure that Wikipedia is demonstrating the diversity that truly exists in STEM, and making sure that we, again, are amplifying the profiles and voices of Black people in STEM. And we have Jess Wade, who is an expert Wikipedia person, coming to help us facilitate that. And so we would like to make that a quarterly initiative. And then, like Alexis shared, I am also in some conversations about having a conference, and whether that be a standalone Black in science communication conference or a joint conference with the other Black in movements, that will definitely be happening somehow, hopefully in person next year safely, but if not, virtually.
Alexis, do you want to tell us what's next for you?
Yeah, I mean, similarly, right? So our conference and kind of continuing on to build Black in Genetics is a concrete scientific society is number one on the to-do list. Perhaps tied for first place is taking care of my Drosophila. I'm still a graduate student, and it is very, very difficult to navigate this crazy Twitter world and still, be going to lab 2 times a day, every day. And so that's really my primary focus as well, and making sure that I'm meeting those deadlines too.
Okay, terrific. Is there anything else in our last couple of minutes that you'd like to add that you think we left out, or that that's important to add?
I would like to say thank you so much. Raven is one of my super scientific heroes. I've been watching you on Twitter, following for quite a while. And so being able to virtually meet you is a minor dream come true. And being in a conference with, Rosalind Franklin at the title is cherry on top to make it a major dream come true.
Absolutely. Alexis, the feeling is mutual. I've been admiring you from afar, your leadership and your ability to pull together Black in genetics. It's super impressive. And I can't wait to see what's next from you. And likewise, I am honored to be a part of the Rosalind Franklin Society. I am looking forward to seeing the initiatives from the society in the new year and being a part. Thank you for having me.
I want to again thank Raven and Alexis for a terrific discussion. And I want to thank all of you for joining us. Hello, everyone, and welcome to part 2 of the session, How and When to Add Voices. It's a challenge to pack Michelle McMurray Heath's bio into a minute or two, but I'm going to do my best. Most recently, in fact, just earlier this year, Michelle was appointed president and CEO of BIO, the Biotechnology Innovation Organization. She is the third chief executive to lead BIO since its founding in 1993. Before that, she was at J&J, where she served as vice president of global external innovation and global leader for regulatory sciences. Prior to her time at J&J, she was a key science policy leader in the government. The Obama-Biden transition team tapped her to analyze the National Science Foundation's policies, programs, and personnel. President Obama then named her Associate Science Director of the FDA Center for Devices and Radiological Health. The common thread in all of this work across academia, the government, and industry has been Michelle's focus on broadening access to scientific progress so more patients from diverse backgrounds can benefit. She has said that the distribution of scientific progress is the social justice issue of our age. We now will hear a bit more about Michelle's journey and get her perspectives on how we can continue to make change in an industry dominated by white men. Michelle, I'll turn it over to you now.
Well, it's a pleasure to be with you, and I hope you guys have a wonderful seminar and conference, but it's a pleasure to be here today.
Michelle, could you tell us a bit about your personal journey and now what's going on as the head of BIO?
Sure. Well, I was born and raised in Oakland, California by 2 public health leaders, and really learned from an early age that there was a role for figuring out how you distribute the benefits of medicine to wider communities than have easy access. So it was a great training ground, and it really showed me the importance of the types of breakthroughs we have in healthcare to impact individual lives. But as I got to college, and I started out as a psychology major and became a biochemistry major because I fell in love with 2 things. One was the discovery process of working in lab. And 2 was this thought that it's not just about the medicines that we have, but it's about this future progress that medicine is always going to, that biotechnology is always in search of. And that like continual hunt for knowledge and progress, I think, is one of the most amazing things about our biotech ecosystem. And I've been in love with it ever since. So that, I would say, has been kind of my guiding light and principle. But as I went to Duke University to do an MD PhD, it was clear to me as I was doing my lab research on gene recombination in T cells that what I was working on was not always understood or appreciated by, for example, family and friends back in California, and that there were a lot of political strings being pulled, determining which research got funded, which research was pursued. And it struck me that these two communities, science funders and the patients that are dependent upon the fruits of the science, were not necessarily intersecting. And I've been trying to pull them closer together ever since. And so I went from there to do a science policy fellowship in Washington, D.C. At the National Science Foundation, ended up then working for Senator Lieberman for 4 years. It was supposed to be a 1-year sabbatical from working in the hospital, and it turned into 4 years, and worked on his presidential campaign. And then I worked in the think tank space for 5 years, building a health and science section of that think tank, the Aspen Institute, before getting tapped for a transition team and then going into the FDA. So it's been an interesting journey, but what I love about coming to bio at this particular juncture is it feels like all of those experiences are utilized each and every day. And that's incredibly fulfilling. And there's nothing better, I think, in the world than standing up and being a cheerleader for this incredible industry at bio, which, you know, has really shown its true colors during the COVID pandemic. I mean, our companies have 838 research and development programs underway just targeted at combating COVID. 191 vaccines in development. So it just tells you that we have such ingenuity and such dedication to improving human health that it is amazing to see these entrepreneurs really focus on this huge scourge and try to solve it.
Terrific. Okay, and how can we help to add voices of more young scientists and minority scientists?
So, you know, that's always been a challenge. At Bio this summer, we launched our bioequality agenda, which has 3 pillars, really aimed at diversifying not only the ranks of biotech, but also the impact and reach of biotech. And so the first pillar to that end is around health disparities, and it's really calling on our member companies. We represent over 1,000 biotech companies, 95% of whom are small companies, to diversify their clinical trials and make sure that we're all fighting for ending of health disparities. The second pillar is really aimed at your question, which is trying to give better line of sight to the great young female and minority talent that we have within our ranks or that are hoping to enter our ranks. Many of our larger companies and some of our medium-sized companies have minority or women training programs. I, for one, benefited from a United Negro College Fund Merck Fellowship when I was in graduate school. And it was a great opportunity not just to get some extra funding and some extra lab support, but to also learn about what we do in the industry. But once you go through those programs, you're usually lost to follow-up, or you're only followed up by the company that sponsored the program. And so we at Bio are trying to build a LinkedIn type atmosphere so that all the alumni from those programs can be visible to all of the companies in our ecosystem. And this is incredibly important because while our smaller companies might not have the dedicated resources really targeted at increasing diversity and inclusion, they want to make sure they have diverse personnel, in part because it helps them accomplish their goals. It helps them solve complex scientific problems more quickly. But if they don't have diversity, if they then partner with or are acquired by our larger companies, then that sets back the progress as well. So we need to make sure that diversity and inclusion is going entirely through our ecosystem.
Okay, terrific. And what role can the industry play in this?
Well, our industry leaders have been phenomenal. I just today saw another announcement of a huge donation made by AbbVie, for example, focused at diversity and inclusion. So our corporate leaders are really stepping up to the plate. And I actually think the industry is one of the best sectors for young and minority scientists to enter, because I've worked in the academic sector as well as the federal government sector, as well as the private sector. And the private sector is really about getting things done, and it's not necessarily tied to tradition as much as some of those other sectors, particularly in our small biotech companies. And so it's a great opportunity to really be recognized for your skill, to have lots of different opportunities and challenges thrown at you, and to really show that you can shine in a variety of areas. So I highly recommend looking at working with those smaller biotech companies as a way to really learn about the industry and put your science to a new use.
I am on websites of biotech companies, multiple websites every day. And I do see in the C-suite when far too often when I get on the team page, it all looks very, very much the same. So what recommendations can you give to the industry to not just hiring, young new voices, but also promoting women and having more diversity in the C-suites, in the leadership positions in the industry? Oh, you're muted, Michelle.
Thank you. It's incredibly important. And, at that level of organizations, you often hear the term cultural fit, and people bandy that around as if it's benign, and not realizing that culture is very specific. And it's not necessarily just about company culture. It's about the culture you're bringing with you in the door from your own families and your own backgrounds. And so we have to be open to more cultural flexibility. I think this is something we really need to promote. Initiatives like the NASDAQ's initiative recently to add more transparency to the diversity on corporate boards, and making sure that any NASDAQ listed company posts their diversity statistics for their board membership is incredibly important, and initiatives that we've seen in California now insisting that publicly traded companies have diversity represented on their boards, not just for women, which has been incredibly successful, but also for racial minorities. Those sorts of initiatives will give more cultural flexibility around the governing board table, which I think very soon after will translate to more diversity around the C-suite, because I really think that board C-suite relationship is so key, that's really where the culture has to shift.
There's no other topic more important at the moment than COVID-19. So how would you suggest, or what recommendations can you give for the industry and all of the advances and innovation that's being done? How do you think that those can be rolled out in the most equitable way?
Yeah, well, it's a lot about the messenger. Our companies have done an incredible job to date of trying to diversify their COVID-19 clinical trials. We've been partnering with a lot of those companies individually. A lot of them are our member companies, and some of the results are astounding. There's usually an average of 5% African-American participation in clinical trials. For both of the two recent COVID vaccine trials, Moderna and Pfizer, it was at 10%. And they had levels of 35 and 42% people of color overall. So our companies are making a concerted effort, and that's critically important because people will be able to see themselves in the data. Now we're in that final home stretch of at least those products. There's many more yards to go. And now it's about making sure that we are clear about the message, and that we put the message in terms that everyone can relate to. And to that end, Bio just the end of last week launched our COVID vaccine facts.org website that provides really lay accessible language information about the COVID vaccines and the science behind vaccines, because we think that's critically important. But there's a lot miles to go before we sleep. Let's put it that way.
Okay, and please, can you provide 1 or 2 recommendations for the new administration in Washington? How can we resurrect the importance of science and support more women and underrepresented minorities in this critical work?
Yes, so it's important that we continue our focus on diversifying clinical trials. I think that's very, very key. We're making some small strides, but there's a lot more to go. And I also hope that the new administration will be very open to all sources of information and all voices around the table. All indications are that they will be, and that's very reassuring to see. But it's going to be very, very important for us to continue our pattern of partnership, companies, academia, federal agencies working together to attack not just COVID, but some of the other very important issues that we still face.
Okay, well, we want to thank you so much for joining us today. We've learned so much. So thanks again for being here. And thanks to all of you for joining us today for this session. Stay safe and we'll see you again soon.